Hi all, you're very welcome to episode 3 of the 3D Design Bureau podcast. I'm joined here by Nicholas Polly, a usual suspect on the podcast, our managing director, and I have Richard Dalton as our special guest. He's our associate director and the head of our Daylight and Sunlight department. With the podcast, we release it every second Thursday, and it's wherever you find your podcasts. So on YouTube, on Spotify, on iTunes. We shoot the breeze on all things surrounding the AEC sector and 3D design. And today's topic is revolving around BRE Daylight and Sunlight Assessments, which Richie is definitely going to help us out with. So how are we, lads? Yeah. How are we getting on?
I'm all good. How are you?
Good. No hassle at all. This is round 2 of recording the podcast today, so hoping there is no technical glitches this time around.
It was much nicer when we could see the three of us on the screen. Like, now I'm just looking at myself again.
You've never complained about that?
No.
Sly dig now because we're remote now.
Yeah, true. Welcome aboard, Richie. You've been roped into this for... as the first guinea pig for our podcast, so
yeah, I'd say it's lovely to be here, but like you said, I've been roped in, so
yeah, kicking and screaming like a child.
Happy to be here, Nick.
Yes, albeit like 5:10 in the evening as we're recording, and the light's getting worse outside. So,
well, you said it was the second recording. We did give up our lunch break for the first recording.
Yeah, well, we won't talk about technical issues. We're supposed to be taking steps forward with our technical department, Kevin, not steps backwards. So we might try and figure that one out for the next one anyway.
In fairness, we were only 25 minutes in when the technical glitch hit. So, you know.
True. But it's all good. Yeah. So we're gonna discuss a hot topic at the moment, which is daylight sunlight.
That's right, yeah, so that's why we have Richie on board. So Nick, you have quite a good knowledge of BRE Daylight and Sunlight Assessments. I have relatively zero knowledge of the topic, so I'm going to be asking questions as a complete dummy, which will hopefully be good for some of our listeners.
Yeah, no change there then. No change there. Yeah, so I've got a very good high level view, but I think it's good having Richie on board just for more in-depth information about the actual process, maybe, and what we've experienced over the last. Yes, exactly, and heading up that area of the business quite successfully over the last 1 to 2 years in particular. But we've been doing it for a number of years, but it's certainly ramped up over the last year in particular, especially with judicial reviews that happened.
We're at 5 or 6 years now.
Yeah, God, right, okay. But it's certainly ramped up though, Richie, hasn't it?
Look,
like,
the last it's come to your attention more in the last 1 or 2 years because of the nature of it. You know, it's more problematic, it's more sensitive. Certainly at the start it was, you know, I just, you know, done it, I reported back to you, but there wasn't as much need for you to get involved, so you're more acutely aware of it in the last couple of years, but we've been doing it for 5 or 6 years, if you believe that.
Yeah, but I think also though the fact that a lot of it's changed now. It's a mandatory, well, it's not mandatory, but it more or less is mandatory on most projects now, and especially large scale schemes and SHDs, which we know is coming to an end. But it's now the go-to document for, you know, EIRs and all that sort of stuff. So it's certainly, you know, from a planning perspective, it's essential to have a daylight sunlight assessment carried out.
So Richie, on that, people think your work is all sunshine and rainbows, but excuse the pun.
You've been practicing that joke all morning, have you?
I like how you apologise for it as if it was unplanned the second time round.
Oh, what could I say? I'll get it right on the next one. Hopefully there isn't a next one. No technical glitches. But Richie, on that, you've been involved with daylight and sunlight reports for us here for the last 5 years. So could you just give us a quick overview of what a BRE Daylight and Sunlight Assessment is and what our team does?
Yeah, I suppose it can be broken down into two parts. There's the impact analysis, which would be the assessment of how the proposed development is going to impact on the neighbouring properties, whether it's the daylight and sunlight of their windows or the sunlight in their gardens. And then the second category would be the scheme performance, how the daylight and sunlight of the proposed development itself performs. Do they have enough daylight in their rooms, in their bedrooms, and their kitchens and their living rooms? And do they have enough sunlight in the proposed amenity areas, whether that's gardens or courtyards or roof gardens or whatever? It depends on the scheme. But they're the two categories, the two main categories: how the development performs itself and how it impacts on its surrounding environment.
Good stuff. So we will get back into the bit of nitty gritty of it. But Nick, from your perspective as managing director and deal with a lot of these coming in, what's the type of client that would go for a BRE Daylight Sunlight Assessment? Who needs this technical report?
Anyone that's doing development right now, particular any sort of medium large scale schemes, but it spans across every type of development. We've even recently got requests for, say, house extensions where a neighbour might be objecting on the grounds of sunlighting, and the planning authority has said, look, yeah, you need to carry out a proper sunlighting assessment. We sit alongside the design team, in particular the architectural team and the planning consultants, working underneath the client, obviously the who's going to be submitting the actual scheme and building it. So we work very closely, and we've been an integral part of the design team when it comes to daylight sunlight. So yeah, it's you would have mainly seen it probably a few years ago, Richie, wouldn't you, on more the larger scale schemes, but now it's across the board, and we're seeing it on everything. It's one of the most, well, I'd say it's probably one of the key reports that have to be submitted for schemes, especially schemes that are sensitive, that are surrounded by a lot of existing context, like existing properties that might look like it's going to have an adverse impact on the surrounding context. And then also a big focus now is in well-being and proper performing developments, and daylight sunlight is part of that. So planning authorities are very keen to make sure that guidelines that we work to are met and that schemes are performing well for future occupants that will inhabit them.
So Richie, I suppose, what stage does a client come to you? Is it like in the design phase, or is it when there's feedback from the planning authority? What stage would one of these assessments be taken out?
They can come to us at any stage during the design process, essentially. It depends on how pragmatic they are. We've had clients that would come to us, they have the conceptual massing done, or they have an idea of what they want to put on the scheme, and they want to make sure that they don't go too far along the design process in one way and then have to roll back later on. So it's very good to get the assessment done as early as you can, because we've seen it before where somebody would come to us with the design almost finished, or indeed actually finished, and then when we run the assessment we highlight problems, then they have to go back and rework the design at a stage of design where that's very difficult. Where had they come to us at the early phases, we're able to give them guidance and instruction to help them set off on the right path. In terms of who comes to us or when they have to come to us, like Nick said, it can be very, very small schemes or very, very large schemes. In some cases it's not necessary and the design will go so far, and the planning authorities may request the daylight and sunlight assessment to be done, in which case they come to us and we get it done. In other cases they know it's going to be asked for, so they get out ahead of the request and they get it done early doors. And my advice would definitely be to get the assessment done as early as possible, and we can give high level overviews. They don't have to have the design fleshed out. We're able to say, this design or this area here is going to be problematic. You're too close to the boundary here, you're too high there, whatever the case may be. Every case will be different, but we can give good advice early doors, and that would be my recommendation to anyone thinking about getting it done, or anyone wondering should they get it done.
And that's a really interesting point, actually, because one of the things we're trying to do now, in particular with the larger scale schemes, is have that initial high level overview. So sitting down with the architect, like we've just been appointed on a scheme, a large scheme, but before we even got appointed, I was sitting down with the architect, going through plans, looking at pinch points of some units that may not work well, looking at open amenity spaces. So what that does, like if you spend an hour or two at the very top of the project, it can save days of work down the far end, because if we get if we get a cleaner bill of health on our first pass of results, it just makes everyone's life so much easier, and not just our life and the client's life. Actually, interesting enough, it's also down the track with all the other consultants who may have been given a drawing pack and suddenly, oh sorry, the drawings have to change because the daylight sunlight's to change. So it's a really important thing to get in as early as you can. And you know, another thing that Richie touched on as well about the whole impact, and when you're in a constrained site, say in the city centre, you know, that initial push-pull exercise on a massing model, we're coming out the far end of a project at the moment where we started off with just a massing model from the architects and said, look, what can we work with here? Where are we very much constrained? And we identified a couple of key areas of the surrounding context that was a problem on the massing model. We were able to do a couple of workshops, and now the architect is nearly at full design and hopefully expecting a clean bill of health out the far side because they've worked on the massing. So I think it is, as Richie said, they can come to us at any stage, but there's nothing worse than a client or a design team coming to us when they're just about to lodge planning and say, oh, listen, can you just get this daylight sunlight? We think it should be all right. We test it, there's issues. And then suddenly we're rowing back on design or making design changes, design interventions, you know, which are really important. Now, that's something that we pride ourselves here on, and that Richie has an exceptionally good and high reputation amongst our clients with, is that whole area of working with the design team to implement design interventions to help a scheme perform better, and to give credit to the rest of the daylight team. Like Richie heads up the team, but we've a very strong team here who work very closely with design teams to make sure that their schemes perform well.
Yeah, and it's not just the daylight sunlight team either. We have a modelling team behind us as well. So all of the assessments we do is run off models, and you know, having the modelling team separate to the daylight sunlight team, it means that we're able to, you know, play into people's strengths and get the models developed up quicker and to a high standard before it goes through the assessment stage. So back when we started, you know, the 5 or 6 years ago, you know, you're saying I was a one-man band. I was doing this by myself in the company, and I may have been the only person in the company doing daylight and sunlight at the time, but I was by no means a one-man band. I had a very, you know, experienced modelling team behind me, working with me to do that. Like we've been in business 21 years, Nick, if I'm not wrong.
22
years
Richie, 22.
Now. So, you know, the modelling team, the main core of the business, as you guys obviously know, and I'm sure a lot of the listeners will know, is architectural visualization. So the daylight sunlight was a natural progression from that, because we had the models. You know, we were building the models to such a high level of detail anyway for the visualization process, that it was a natural progression to run the analysis on those models. So we kind of took the modeling scale that we had and transformed that into daylight sunlight as we have it now. So, you know, the two very much work hand in hand.
And it's actually, that's a really good point, actually, because, and something like communication between the teams is really important then, obviously, and it's one of our culture points is communication and collaboration. So that's really strong. But the fact that we're using the same model, it's actually advantageous when we're working on the full 3D planning pack. So the imagery, which is CGI's verified views, and the sunlight daylight. And we're also now looking into wind assessment as well. So because it's I suppose, not to call it the usual one-stop shop, but like it just makes sense for us to be doing more energy assessment on buildings, considering we have that sort of team behind us that Richie mentioned with the modelling team, you know. So yeah, it's good.
And on that, Richie, you said that catching a design at an early stage is very beneficial in terms of seeing if it doesn't meet target values, the scheme. What design changes can be made to improve the target values if a scheme is at an early design stage?
Well, it depends. If you're looking at the impact analysis, your target values, you know, really go around your density, your massing, you know, how close you are to your boundaries, how tall your building is. So if you have a particularly high level of impact on a neighbouring window, it really is about trying to move the development further away from that window or make the development less tall in that area. Another thing that's really important is we're talking about, you know, how can we get full compliance and how can we meet all the guidelines. Quite often we don't get full compliance in the scheme, and a scheme doesn't necessarily have to achieve full compliance to get planning permission. You know, there's a certain degree of flexibility within the planning authorities can apply to it. You know, if you have a heavily constrained site in the city centre, you mightn't be able to build anything to appropriate size, and there is a ministerial mandate for increased density in our city centre, in our city centre in Dublin, but I think in general in the city centres and the dense areas, they're looking to increase that density. So sometimes it's not a case of getting full compliance. Sometimes it's a case of making sure that the impact is not so far away from the guidelines, and they are guidelines. It's important to stress that. So just to wrap that point up, if you want to reduce the impact, it's generally you have to reduce your massing. You have to step away from your neighbours or step down in height. And that isn't always commercially viable for the developer. The other area is improving the performance of the scheme itself. So the daylight performance within the proposed habitable rooms, your bedrooms, your kitchens, your living rooms, your LKDs, etc., and the sunlight within the proposed amenity areas. So the sunlight again is quite closely related to massing and to orientation and site constraints, etc. But there's more flexibility in terms of the performance of the daylight within the proposed units. You have more control over that because you have the freedom to change the layout of your apartments. Long, deep units are generally underperform. If there's a balcony in play, a balcony is the biggest challenge when it comes to daylight. There is a necessity to have balconies. Certainly in build to sell schemes for residents, you have to have a minimum balcony space per unit. The majority of balconies should be off living spaces. So your apartment guidelines, as published in December 22, state that it's preferable to have balconies accessible from living spaces. Now usually when people build these things, they build them in a stacked system, heaven to hell they call it. So it makes it much more commercially viable and affordable to build if everything is in a linear process. And if you have a linear process or a linear stack like that, your living space on your first floor is directly below the living space on the second floor and third floor, etc., etc., etc. And what you get with that is the balcony that's servicing the living space on the first floor is above the living space on the ground floor, and above the balcony is servicing the second floor is above the first floor, etc., etc. Now a balcony, when it comes to daylight, is the equivalent to wearing a cap on a summer's day. It blocks off the top part of the sky, and if you have an adjacent obstruction to that, coupled with the balcony, that can cause problems, especially if the unit is quite deep. So there's four things that I would usually say cause reductions to daylight. You've got your depth of your unit, you've got your obstructions from balconies directly above, you have your adjacent obstructions, and then if you have any sort of perpendicular obstructions like recessed balconies, tend to perform quite badly. If you've got a unit behind a recessed balcony, you're blocking the light coming in from the left and right. Then your balcony above is blocking the light coming in from above. Your adjacent obstruction will block light coming in from a low level, and then the depth of the unit means that light has to penetrate a deeper a deeper space. So, you know, they're the 4 things to watch out for. You know, it can work successfully if you shave off 1 or 2 of those, but if you put all 4 together at the same time, you generally will have quite bad issues with daylight.
See, I told you, Kevin, to bring him in because I wouldn't have been able to. Well, I know all that, but like to actually succinctly put that across. But actually, just a couple of just a couple of points that Richie made there. You know, one of them being not reaching full compliance. I think what the planning authorities like to see as well is that you have justification to why you're not meeting full compliance, or where there might be deficiencies in your scheme that you're providing compensatory design measures. So, for example, if some of your units are underperforming, that you're given a communal space, indoor communal space for residents of the scheme as well. So, like, justification is really important as to why you might be impacting more than what you should be, or that you're not reaching full compliance. And design compensatory design measures, like, they're 2 really key things that the planning authorities will look for. Yeah, well, when they get a submitted report.
The apartment guidelines do state that that you don't have to reach full compliance, and they do look for 2 things. It's compensation is one of them, and the other is justification. So you have to clearly identify where you're not compliant, give a justification as to why that is, which is usually something like site constraints. But a compensatory measure should be put forward as well, and that's up to the architect or the planning consultant or the developer to put that forward. You know, that's not the remit of the daylight analysis. You know, we don't know if the apartment is oversized, or we don't know if they have given, you know, extra balcony space to compensate for the low levels of daylight. There's many different compensation measures that can be put forward, but it's important that they are where they can be. And if they're not, you should just hold your hand up and say, listen, this is underperforming because of this, we don't have a compensation, and give the planning authorities as much information as they can, as you can, to let them make a fully informed decision.
And another big thing as well, like, it's not always just a simple case of let's make the windows bigger to get the more daylight into the units. You know, there is the other elements that Richie mentioned about external obstructions, and, you know, there's a certain number of units that need to make the scheme commercially viable. There's also buildability for a scheme, and whether or not the cost of building it, and even the actual logistics and of building a scheme, is going to work based on what we might advise. So, for example, if we say, you just make floor to ceiling glazing and full width glazing, then you've also got to take into consideration solar gains. You've got to take into consideration solar glare. So there's a lot of factors. It's, you know, and that's why coming in, just going back to my previous point, coming in early on the design stage of the project is really important, because you can mitigate against stuff like that, and get, you know, talking with other consultants who might be doing other assessments. So that's really important as well, to consider that during projects.
I would generally advise people, like, try get as much compliance as you can. You should definitely be aiming to get full compliance, but if you don't get full compliance, you have to make sure that you're not too far away from compliance. So if you have a target value of 2%, you know, don't be going in with something that's, you know, 1%. You know, don't be going in half of it, and make sure that the frequency in which you have non-compliance is not too great as well. You know, you shouldn't be going in with a 1,000 unit apartment and 500 units don't meet the guidelines, or even 200 for that matter. You know, you have to try get as close to full compliance as you possibly can. You know, and where you don't get full compliance is because you can't, not because you haven't addressed it properly.
So essentially, it seems like architecture has transitioned to making great design into a checklist almost of compliance, especially with the daylight and sunlight assessments, which have really gathered steam and have become mandatory for a lot of developments. It seems that it's influenced design. Would you say that's correct?
I was going to say, a lot of the principles in terms of good daylight have been happening for years. You know, like if you look at your old Victorian buildings, they all have high windows. They've got better floor to ceiling heights on the ground floor, and then that reduces as you go up the floors. You know, a lot of the principles that we would preach have been practiced historically. It's just a case of, you know, in this consumer driven world that we live in, you know, the architects are being put on the squeeze by clients to improve density, get more units in, and that all has just, you know, over the course of time manifested itself in, you know, the architectural principles, you know, getting softer and softer, and now because of the way that's gone, you know, it's necessary for these assessments to be carried out to make sure that we don't go too far in the wrong direction.
But I also think as well, there's a lot more emphasis now on green building, and people want to have better quality of living inside their buildings. So daylight sunlight is part of that, is a key part of that. Look at how many times if you walked into a house or an apartment or something and it's really dark, it's just immediately affects people. So I think it's really important, and now there is that stronger emphasis on it because planning authorities are pushing the agenda more. So I think more thought is now being given to it. Like Richie, remember the battles that we've had, like, you know, 2-3 years ago when we were doing, like, on some projects where, you know, there were certain architects who wouldn't have taken as much care and attention when it came to sunlight daylight, and just didn't agree with what was being pushed by the planning authorities. But they've had to row in now because it's a key thing for planning, you know what I mean? And I think it's good for overall. Look, it's good. We could say commercially it's good for us because we're growing and with in that area of the business. But like, think of the future occupants, and we've had this discussion, Richie, a few times. It's for the better of them at the end of the day. You know what I mean? So like if what we do,
the amount of studies that have been done, you know, linking, you know, good quality of daylight to mental health and stuff is staggering, and they're all come back with the same thing. You know, daylight does contribute quite strongly towards mental health, you know, from a general mood point of view, but also links to your circadian rhythm being disrupted. You know, it can affect your sleep if you don't have enough daylight. You know, there's loads of studies out there that all point in the same direction.
Right, so it kind of appears we've more technical problems, Kev. So I think Richie's dropped off. In fairness, he probably did it on purpose because he's probably thinking, Jesus, I've got tons of work to do. But like,
it's gone by
I think this is what,
like, you know.
Yeah, exactly. But I think, to be fair, it's a topic we'll definitely revisit because we're only like even over the last, say, 30 minutes of this podcast, like we're scratching the surface of it. But like, there's tons of, like, that's why I wanted Richie on the podcast, because I think he's, in fairness, he's well on top of his game when it comes to sunlight daylight. And that's what I was saying, that so many clients like have massive respect for him because he just knows the ins and outs of it, and he knows how to make schemes work. He teaches the team so well and gives so much information that they're all sort of coming up behind them, which is just so valuable, like, you know. So it was great to have him on, and I think, like, we could have got into, we could have been on this call for what, an hour and a half, like, do you know what I mean? With everyone falling asleep.
Yeah, so I think we need to revisit it someday.
Yeah, 100%, like, you know, and it's brilliant to hear that information, and hopefully listeners will take nuggets of information away with them, you know. I think if there's one piece of information to take away, it's definitely get in sooner rather than later with a development and get the assessment going to try and prevent too much surgery on a scheme when you're too far down the track, which only just ends up costing time and money across the board with all consultants and clients, like, you know. So yeah, it's been good. It's been good. What I have you, thanks for the loan of the old cardigan, because I forgot my own memo about wearing striped shirt today. So I had to borrow your cardigan, although I do like it, so I might be wearing it home.
I was going to say, don't make any excuses from that cardigan. That's a great cardigan now.
Yeah, I think that cardigan suits me better than you. It fits me better than you, so, you know.
Pennies, hun.
Yeah. Nothing wrong with pennies, man.
You can't beat pennies. But, well, I have to say that the podcast definitely took a turn when Richie jumped off. Here we are talking about high fashion in pennies, you know? That's
we're gonna have to keep bringing. We're gonna have to keep bringing on those guests that are those people that actually know stuff.
Exactly. So we don't divulge. So I'm more than happy with that, Nick. Are you more than happy?
Yeah,
so
all good. Yeah.
That is a wrap on what was a technically challenged podcast of episode 3 of the 3D Design Podcast. So if you do want to get in touch, drop us a line at 3D Design Bureau on Twitter, on LinkedIn, on Facebook, on Instagram, you name it, we're on it. And yeah, looking forward to seeing you next time.
All right, take it easy, man. Cheers.
See you guys. Bye now.
Later. Bye.